Before you hit play on another true crime story, ask yourself this: what happens when the person supposed to protect children is the same person keeping them prisoner? On May 2, 2025, 2 kids vanished from a dead-end road in Nova Scotia. The world assumed they wandered off. But unsealed court documents from 2026 tell a different story, one that began 5 months earlier, inside a home where exits were blocked, phones were weapons, and a stepfather's control was absolute. This isn't just about missing children. This is about a house of horrors hiding in plain sight, where allegations of sexual assault and forcible confinement were already brewing long before Lilly and Jack disappeared. While search parties combed the Nova Scotia wilderness, investigators were quietly building a timeline that had nothing to do with lost kids and everything to do with a man who allegedly turned his family into captives. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of the Gearlock Road case, a story so twisted that the stepfather at the center of it all passed a polygraph test, yet sits in court facing charges that could connect his violent past to 2 empty beds. From phantom vehicles prowling at 3 in the morning to a mother's harrowing account of being pinned down and silenced, this case asks one chilling question. Were Lilly and Jack ever really missing, or were they taken by the one person who had complete control over their lives? Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why the truth in Lansdowne, Nova Scotia isn't buried in the woods, it's locked inside a home where communication was a privilege, freedom was an illusion, and 2 children paid the ultimate price. And before we dive deeper, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. The Case Files Collective brings you real crime, real evidence, and real answers. You don't want to miss what's coming next. December 2024. Gearlock Road was quiet. A modest neighborhood in Lansdowne, Nova Scotia, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to stay buried. But inside one unassuming home, a pattern was forming, one that wouldn't be understood until it was far too late. Daniel Martell wasn't a stranger to this family. He was the stepfather. The man who was supposed to bring stability. Protection. But according to later testimony from Malihia, the children's mother, stability came with a price. Court documents unsealed in 2026 paint a picture of a household where control wasn't just psychological, it was physical. Malihia would later tell investigators about moments that made her blood run cold. Moments where she tried to reach out to her family, only to have Daniel physically block her path. She described being pinned down, her phone ripped from her hands mid-call, her voice silenced before it could reach the outside world. These weren't one-time incidents. They were a pattern. A system. A cage built not with bars, but with fear and force. And no one outside that home knew. To the neighbors, Daniel seemed like any other guy. Quiet. Kept to himself. Maybe a little intense, but nothing alarming. Malihia's family, however, started noticing red flags. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts were left unread. When they did manage to connect, Malihia's voice sounded strained. Guarded. Like someone was listening. But even then, no one could have predicted what was coming. Because in December 2024, while the world went about its holiday routines, something darker was allegedly taking root inside that house. According to charges filed over a year later, this was the month Daniel Martell began a pattern of sexual assault and forcible confinement. Not against strangers. Against the people living under his roof. The invisible prison had been built. And Lilly and Jack were living inside it. By the spring of 2025, the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Malihia's family had gone from concerned to alarmed. Weeks would pass without a single returned call. When they did manage to get through, the conversations were brief, almost scripted. Malihia would say everything was fine, but her tone suggested otherwise. There was always an excuse. Always a reason she couldn't talk longer. Always a sense that someone else was controlling the narrative. What they didn't know was that Daniel had turned communication into a privilege he could grant or revoke at will. According to Malihia's later statements to police, her phone wasn't really hers anymore. It was a tool Daniel used to isolate her. When she tried to reach out, he'd physically intervene, snatching the device, blocking doorways, using his body as a barrier between her and freedom. It wasn't just control. It was captivity dressed up as a relationship. And the children? They were watching it all unfold. Lily was 6. Jack was 4. Old enough to sense tension, young enough to not fully understand why mom couldn't talk to grandma anymore. Why the front door always seemed to be guarded. Why their stepfather's mood dictated the temperature of the entire house. They lived in a world where normalcy was conditional, and safety was never guaranteed. Then came May 1, 2025. A seemingly ordinary Wednesday. Lily and Jack were their usual selves, playing, laughing, being kids. There was nothing outwardly wrong. No signs of illness. No red flags that would make anyone think the next 24 hours would change everything. But the following morning, May 2nd, Malihia made a call to the school. The kids wouldn't be coming in. A minor cough, she said. Nothing serious. Just keeping them home as a precaution. The school didn't question it. Why would they? Kids get sick. Parents keep them home. It happens every day. Except court documents filed in 2026 suggest this wasn't about a cough. This was about control. About keeping Lily and Jack away from teachers who might notice something. Away from mandatory reporters who might ask questions. Away from anyone who could see past the carefully constructed illusion Daniel had built. That morning, the children were home. Under Daniel's watch. Cut off from the outside world in a house where exits were monitored and communication was a weapon. And by that afternoon, they were gone. The 911 call didn't come right away. In most cases involving missing children, parents call the moment they realize something's wrong. Panic sets in. Every second counts. But in the Martell household, hours passed before authorities were notified. Hours that investigators would later scrutinize with surgical precision. What were Daniel and Malihia doing during that window? Were they frantically searching the property, hoping the kids had just wandered into the woods? Or was something else happening, something that required time to prepare, to clean, to create a story that would hold up under questioning? When the call finally came, the narrative was simple: Lily and Jack had wandered off. The parents had been asleep. When they woke up, the children were gone. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. Just 2 kids who allegedly walked out of a house on a dead-end road and vanished into thin air. But dead-end roads don't offer many escape routes. And 6-year-olds don't typically orchestrate silent exits in the middle of the day without anyone noticing. The official search began immediately. Volunteers flooded Gearlock Road. Search dogs were deployed. Helicopters scanned the Nova Scotia brush. Every neighbor was interviewed. Every trail was walked. The community rallied around the grieving parents, holding vigils and posting flyers with Lily and Jack's faces plastered across social media. Daniel stood at the center of it all, playing the role of the devastated stepfather. He spoke to the press. He thanked the volunteers. He begged for anyone with information to come forward. And for months, the world believed him. But while the public search continued above ground, investigators were quietly digging into something far more disturbing. Because one neighbor, someone who lived close enough to see the comings and goings on Gearlock Road, had a story that didn't match the official timeline. This neighbor reported seeing a vehicle on the night of May 2nd. Not during the day when the kids supposedly wandered off. Not in the early evening when parents might still be searching. But at 3 o'clock in the morning. On a dead-end road where there's no reason to drive unless you live there. And this vehicle wasn't just passing through. It was moving back and forth. Slowly. Deliberately. Like someone was looking for something. Or making sure something stayed hidden. The neighbor's statement wasn't made public right away. It sat in an investigator's file, a puzzle piece that didn't fit the narrative Daniel and Malia were selling. But in 2026, when court documents were unsealed, that statement became a smoking gun. Because if the parents were asleep in the master bedroom like they claimed, who was driving that vehicle? And what were they doing on a road with no outlet at 3 in the morning? The question wasn't just about two missing children anymore. It was about what happened in the hours before the world was allowed to know they were gone. It was about a timeline that didn't add up and a dead-end road that suddenly felt more like a crime scene than a search zone. For 8 months, Daniel Martell played his part flawlessly. He showed up to every press conference with the right amount of anguish in his eyes. He stood beside Malia at candlelight vigils, holding her hand as the community prayed for Lilly and Jack's safe return. He shared posts on social media, thanked volunteers, and kept the case alive in the public consciousness. To the outside world, he was a man shattered by tragedy, doing everything he could to bring his stepchildren home. But behind closed doors, investigators were assembling a very different picture. Because while Daniel was playing the grieving stepfather in front of cameras, detectives were combing through his past, his phone records, his movements on the night of May 2nd, and most critically, the statements Malia had begun to give about life inside that house. The first cracks appeared in the fall of 2025. Malia started talking. Not to the press, but to investigators who had begun to suspect that the missing children case was only the surface of something much darker. She described a home where Daniel's word was law. Where defiance was met with physical force. Where she had been systematically isolated from anyone who might help her escape. And then she revealed the violence. According to her statements, Daniel hadn't just controlled her movements and her phone. He had assaulted her. Repeatedly. She described incidents where he used his size and strength to overpower her, to take what he wanted, to remind her that in that house, she had no autonomy. No voice. No escape. The allegations were brutal, specific, and backed by a timeline that stretched back months before the children disappeared. Investigators cross-referenced her account with other evidence. Neighbors who had seen Daniel's temper flare. Friends who noticed Malia pulling away. Digital records showing deleted messages and blocked contacts. Piece by piece, the case against Daniel Martell began to take shape, and it had nothing to do with two kids wandering into the woods. On January 26, 2026, the hammer finally dropped. Daniel Martell was arrested, but not for the disappearance of Lilly and Jack. The charges were sexual assault and forcible confinement, with the incidents allegedly occurring between December 1, 2024, and May 2, 2025. That date range wasn't random. It covered the entire period leading up to the children's disappearance, painting a picture of a man who had been a predator in his own home long before the world started searching the Nova Scotia wilderness. The arrest sent shockwaves through Lansdowne. People who had stood beside Daniel at vigils felt betrayed. Volunteers who had searched alongside him felt sick. And investigators finally had the leverage they needed to connect the dots between a violent, controlling stepfather and two children who vanished under his watch. But here's where the case takes a turn that true crime analysts are still debating today. Because despite the mounting evidence, despite Malia's testimony, despite the timeline that placed Daniel at the center of a house of horrors, he did something that threw everyone off balance. He took a polygraph test. And he passed. Polygraphs aren't admissible in most courts, and for good reason. They're not foolproof. They measure physiological responses to stress, not truth. But in the court of public opinion, a passed polygraph carries weight. And Daniel's defense team made sure everyone knew about it. They framed him as a man being railroaded by a justice system desperate for answers, using unrelated allegations to paint him as a monster when the real story was far more complicated. So what do we make of this? Is Daniel Martell a psychopath so skilled at deception that he can manipulate a machine designed to catch liars? Or is he a man guilty of terrible things, assault, control, abuse, but not guilty of making two children disappear? It's the ultimate true crime paradox, and it's one that keeps this case from having a clean resolution. Some experts argue that people who commit violent acts within intimate relationships can compartmentalize their guilt in ways that allow them to pass polygraphs when asked about unrelated crimes. Others point to the test as proof that investigators are trying to force a connection that doesn't exist, using Daniel's documented violence as a shortcut to solving a missing persons case they can't crack. But let's be clear about what we know for certain. We know Daniel was charged with serious crimes that allegedly took place in the months before Lilly and Jack disappeared. We know Malia described a household where control was absolute and violence was routine. We know a vehicle was seen on Gearlock Road at 3 a.m. when it shouldn't have been there. And we know that in a home where exits were blocked and communication was a weapon, 2 children somehow vanished without a trace. After his arrest, Daniel didn't retreat into silence. He came out swinging. In a statement released through his attorney, he called the allegations against him absolutely insane. He claimed he was being framed by a narrative designed to destroy him, that investigators were using his troubled relationship with Malia to paint him as a child killer when he had nothing to do with their disappearance. He admitted to mistakes, to arguments, to a relationship that had turned toxic, but he vehemently denied any involvement in harming Lilly and Jack. And legally, he might have a point. Because as of today, Daniel Martell has not been charged in connection with the children's disappearance. The charges he faces are related solely to his treatment of Malia. He posted bail under strict conditions. No contact with Malia, regular check-ins with authorities, and a court date set for March 2 that will determine whether the sexual assault and confinement charges move forward. But here's the question that keeps this case alive in the minds of investigators and true crime followers alike. If Daniel is innocent of harming the children, why did they disappear from a house he controlled? If he had nothing to do with it, why was there a vehicle on that road in the dead of night? And if Malia is telling the truth about being held captive in her own home, what does that say about the environment Lilly and Jack were living in during their final days? Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I want to know how far this story is reaching, because cases like this don't get solved by investigators alone. They get solved when people pay attention, ask questions, and refuse to let the truth stay buried. The Nova Scotia wilderness has been searched. Dive teams have combed lakes and ponds. Cadaver dogs have walked every trail within a 10-mile radius of Gearlock Road. But Lilly and Jack remain missing. No bodies. No clothing. No signs of where they went or what happened to them. The official investigation is still open, but it's gone cold in the way that cases do when there are no new leads and no new evidence. Daniel Martell walks free today, waiting for his day in court. Malia is rebuilding her life away from the home where she says she was held captive. And 2 children who should be in school, playing with friends, and living normal lives are gone, reduced to photos on missing posters and a case file that gets thicker but never closer to resolution. The truth about what happened on Gearlock Road might never be fully known. But what we do know is enough to haunt anyone who digs into this case. We know that in a house where a mother couldn't call for help, where exits were controlled, and where violence was allegedly routine, 2 children disappeared under circumstances that defy logic. We know that the man at the center of it all has been charged with crimes that prove he was capable of cruelty long before the world started searching for answers. And we know that somewhere, buried in the silence of a dead-end road, the truth is waiting. If this case teaches us anything, it's that the most dangerous prisons aren't made of concrete and steel. They're made of fear, control, and the belief that no one will come looking. Lilly and Jack deserved better. Malia deserved better. And until someone breaks the wall of silence surrounding Gearlock Road, the only thing thicker than the fog in Lansdowne is the weight of unanswered questions. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to the Case Files Collective. We don't just tell stories. We dig into the evidence, the testimony, and the timelines that others miss. Hit that like button, share this video, and drop a comment letting me know what you think happened on Gearlock Road. Because the conversation doesn't end here. It's just getting started.